Thanks, Cameron. It's a pleasure to be here and particularly to be introduced by you, Cameron. I'll talk about some of Cameron's work today, but what Cameron didn't say is that he's a Catalysis Hub PDRA, and he is working jointly with me and Manchester and York. But I won't be talking about his work, that work today, but I'll talk a little bit about his PhD work. So let me just share my screen. Can you see that all okay? Cameron,
yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent developments in the research in my group, working on new catalytic approaches for bio-based polymers. We've had a long interest in this area, and I'll sort of cut backwards and forwards and really show you some new applications for catalysts that we've been developing over the past few years. But before I do that, I don't need to spend too much time doing this, I don't think, but we need to understand, and it's quite difficult to communicate sometimes, quite what a challenge developing sustainable plastics is. It really is a huge endeavor. So really, you know, anything that we do has at some point to be scalable to a stage almost sort of beyond what I can comprehend anyway. But just a couple of statistics here that really sort of put things in perspective for me. Every minute, 1 million plastic bottles are bought globally. So these are huge commodities. So if, for example, most of those plastic bottles are PET. If we want to replace PET with something more sustainable, then you know, we better make quite a lot of it and make it definitely more sustainable. There's been a lot of projections about plastics. I'll skim over some of them as we go through the introduction. But by 2050, each person on the planet in a business as usual scenario will generate twice their body weight in plastic waste every year. So, you know, there is a significant problem with sustainability of plastics. And I just, those sort of statistics stick in my head better than megatons and gigatons of CO2 and things like that. Having said that, let's get back to some sort of real numbers, just to sort of cement what I've said. So really, plastics are a bulk commodity, and they 99% of them come from the petrochemical industry. This is quite an interesting, this is taken from quite an interesting paper by Levi and Cullen that was published a couple of years ago, which really maps global chemical feedstocks. And you can see 220 megatons per year for thermoplastics, fibers, rubbers, additives. All of these are to do with polymers and plastics. Only fertilizers are a bigger commodity than that. So plastics come from the petrochemical industry, and they really are the major product of the petrochemical industry, or at least the building blocks of them, the monomers from them. And of course, plastics are not standing still. So this is the sort of business as usual scenario. Plastics are forecast to grow in their use, and of course they are, because they're very useful things and absolutely essential for the sustainable world that we want to live in. So the consumption of plastics between now and say the end of this century is set to increase dramatically. So really there is something unsustainable about both of those halves of the slide. One is that they're coming from finite resources, and the second is they're growing at a significant rate. And we're not doing very well at the moment with plastics. This is an interesting paper that was published a few years ago now, which quantifies the primary production of plastics from, say, 1950, from when plastics really started to take off. And you can see more than half of that 8,300 megatons has been discarded. Some of it's in use, and there's a tiny amount of it recycled. And the data in this paper is really quite interesting. You can do all sorts of things with the data, but I'm not going to go through that today. But there's some really quite interesting things that can come out of that in terms of what the anthropogenic impact of turning fossil fuels into plastics really is. And it's, it's quite startling. There's a number of recent reports on plastics. I'll just flag this one up here. That was fantastically led by Charlotte Williams, one of the key members of the Catalysis Hub. And this couple of years ago, the Chemical Sciences and Society Summit, CS3, so that's where a group of global experts get together and address a challenge and think about a particular challenge. In this case, it was to enable sustainable plastics. I would recommend any of you to look at this. It's a very accessible report. It condenses things into very straightforward research challenges that none of us could really argue with. But I guess the key point about these 4 major research challenges is that they all involve chemistry and catalysis at their core. They're all technological solutions that it's necessary to develop that requires fundamental understanding in chemistry in general and catalysis in particular. So have a look at that if you want some of the background of these things. This goes back a bit further, and this is a little bit out of date now, but it sort of leads me into the science that I want to talk about. This was really the first significant attempt to map the global flows, in this case of packaging materials. This was done by McKinsey and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in 2016. Things haven't really changed that much from here. This is 78 million tons as opposed to the 220, but this is just packaging materials. Key things are we've got 98% virgin feedstock, virtually no recycling, lots of leakage into the environment, and the consequences of that we're all aware of. And this is a linear economy for, in this case, packaging materials. And what the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and McKinsey proposed at the time was, of course, being the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that we need a new circular plastics economy. You can argue the toss and things have developed slightly in the 8 or so years since this was published, but the fundamentals of it are still remain. We need to minimize the renewable feedstock that we're feeding into plastic. You could argue that it should be more minimal than that. We need to reuse far more than we can. We need to design things better. There will still inevitably be some environmental leakage. I would argue that that's quite an ambitious, I think it's 1 or 2% when you look at the numbers. That's quite ambitious to reduce it that far. And we will have to do far more recycling, whether that's chemical or mechanical recycling. In fact, all of these things, or many of these things, it comes back to the point I was saying earlier, many of these things require advances in chemical sciences and catalysis and material sciences to realize them. So some of it will be policy, some of it will be behavior change, but the technical challenges are not solved. And they will not be solved in the next 5 years. So just to highlight some of the things that we need to do in slightly more chemical terms, we might want more bio-based feedstocks to replace the fossil feedstocks we've got. And of course, we need sustainable manufacturing processes to make them. They will be catalytic. Manufacturing plastics and polymers is catalytic. So that's one area that many people in the Catalysis Hub, including myself, are interested in. This leakage is going to happen, so we need materials that degrade at an appropriate time, and they need to degrade to benign products. So that's a polymer design challenge for us. Another polymer design challenge is to improve the polymer materials, particularly if we're introducing new feedstocks into here. We can't just deal with the same material properties we have. Why not make materials with better properties? And of course, in order to get to this level of recycling, the recycling technologies that are in play today simply won't be enough. So the mechanical recycling on very select pure streams of waste plastics will have to expand to include mixed plastics, and it will have to expand to include chemical recycling where that's appropriate. And as I said, all of these things are chemical challenges. I'm going to address a couple of those boxes today in some recent research that's been going on in our group. And in particular, I'm going to talk, if I get time, Cameron, I might not talk about your stuff at the end, if I might rush through it at the end, if we get short of time. I don't think we will. But three very talented PhD students, Neve and Philip, who are still completing their PhDs, and Cameron, who completed his PhD a while ago and is now a postdoc in the Catalysis Hub, as I mentioned before. And I'm going to pick on their three projects and just tell you some of the progress that I think is quite interesting that they've been making. And I'll, as we go through, I'll talk about some of the work that's led up to that by way of background. So I'm going to start with talking about the synthesis of polylactide using zirconium amine trisphenolate alkoxide catalysts. And actually, I'm going to talk about mixed polylactide glycolide. But in the first instance, let's just look at what really is the most commercially important or significant today synthetic polymer made from bio-based resources. So I can go through this very quickly. I think polylactide is a well-known material to most people in the audience, I suspect. So lactic acid comes from fermentation of sugars. They may be they may be sugars from sugars and starches from corn or from cane sugar, typically at the moment. But there are developments in biotechnology that are allowing lignocellulosic waste to be used for this part. And then the chemical process takes over here, where you convert lactic acid into lactide, and then do a ring opening polymerization to provide poly-L lactic acid, because the natural enantiomer is the natural diastereomer here is L-lactide. This is made on a scale of a few 100,000 tons per year globally. It's made by 2 or 3 companies, so it's a significant polymer, but in terms of sort of petropolymers, it's still quite small fry. But it's been developed probably over the last 20 or 30 years into a commercially viable process. And the companies that make PLA will tell you that they can't sell enough of it. Investment in new plants is taking place, but there's no material going spare. It's a seller's market at the moment for PLA. The industrial process to do a ring opening polymerization of L-lactide to give high molecular weight and well-controlled poly-L lactide, that's isotactic PLA, is using a tin octanoate catalyst, or at least a tin-based catalyst, typically tin octanoate. And it's done solvent-free, 180 to 200 degrees. It's a melt polymerization, and it gives this nice pure poly-L lactide with appropriate properties. I don't think I need to go through the life cycle of PLA. It is compostable. It's compostable in industrial composting facilities. It's not biodegradable, for example, in seawater. So really, the focus these days is because it's an aliphatic polyamide, the chemical recycling of PLA is reasonably straightforward, at least chemically, if not commercially at the moment. The problem with PLA lies largely in its material properties, which are limited. So they limit the applications that PLA can be used in. It may be its heat resistance, it may be particular barrier properties that are required for packaging materials. It might be the impact properties in terms of an engineering material. But there's a significant interest in enhancing the physical and mechanical properties of PLA, and many people around the world, both industrial and academic groups, have been working on that for a number of years, and there's many ways you can do that. A number of years ago now, and again, this is just by background, and I don't want to go into this in any detail, we discovered a class of catalysts, amine trisphenolates, particularly these zirconium ones with a crystal structure of 1 over here, they're C3 symmetric alkoxide terminated amine trisphenolates. It turns out that they're highly active and highly stereoselective catalysts for the ring opening polymerization of lactide. And we've done a lot of work on this over the years, enhancing the properties of lactide, scaling these up, looking at industrial processes, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on when I talk about one of the other projects we're involved in. But just for now, I think it's sufficient to just note that we can use these alkoxide terminated amine trisphenolates of group 4 metals to do highly selective and stereoselective ring opening polymerization of, in this case, racemic lactide. We've done a lot of work on the mechanism. I don't really want to go into that in any detail at all. But these really, this is the catalytically active species with a growing polymer chain here, and you can see that the lactide monomer coordinates to the zirconium center, which has the growing polymer chain on it, and then that ring opens and inserts to propagate the polymerization. The stereo control mechanism is interesting, but not really relevant to what we're talking about today. It turns out it's an enhanced chain end control mechanism, but that's not really the subject of what we want to talk about today. And in fact, during the time we were developing these catalysts, the use of this ligand scaffold for catalysis in particular, for stereoselective and robust Lewis acids, has expanded quite considerably. So it's a very interesting catalytic platform, and there's a number of examples down here, including the sort of polymers that I've been talking about, but also in fine chemical synthesis. It's quite an interesting catalytic platform. But what I want to talk about today is some work that we've been doing recently on incorporating polyglycolic acid into the polylactic acid and using these polymers to do that in a very controlled way. And this slide here really just summarizes why we might want to do that. Polyglycolic acid is a really interesting polymer. It's the same polymer without a methyl group here on the monomer, and it's the same mechanism same ring opening mechanism to make high molecular weight polymer. It's only more recently actually than PLA has high molecular weight polyglycolic acid been available commercially. It's used in some very specific applications at the moment. There's lots of problems with it. It's brittle, it's very difficult to process, but perhaps most importantly, it hydrolyzes very rapidly. So it's a difficult polymer to ship around the world and do post-polymerization processing on. It hydrolyzes really very rapidly. You can see why, because there's no steric hindrance of the methyl group of the PLA here. However, it does have very high thermal stability. It's highly crystalline, again, because there's not that steric hindrance there, so you get really good monomer interactions. So it has really interesting mechanical properties and stiffness, and actually it's used in oil drilling. That's one of the few applications that it's really useful for at the moment. But in fact, it also has excellent barrier properties. So it can be used in a multi-layer film. It has very good sort of oxygen barrier properties, potentially to lightweight packaging materials. But of course, you can't use it as a homopolymer for these reasons here. We've already talked about PLA and talked about some of the problematic properties, but also the barrier properties of PLA are not great. The copolymer of polyglycolide and polylactide, or polyglycolic acid and polylactic acid, has been known for a very long time. It's used in biomedical applications. But again, typically it's made with a tin catalyst, and it's really what you want for these biomedical applications is a polymer with random monomers along the polymer chain. What we're interested in actually is seeing what happens if we can, in a relatively facile way, using catalytic control, make some more controlled polymers. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we started doing here, or what Neve started doing here a couple of years ago. We can do a one-pot reaction using our zirconium alkoxide catalyst that I introduced earlier. And we can take the two monomers and we can make a copolymer of some sort out of it. We can do that in solution and we can do that in the melt. The mechanism for the polymerization is exactly as I've described. It's coordination insertion mechanism, in fact, and that will give us some type of copolymer, anything from a perfect die block to a completely random distribution of the two monomers used. So we started looking at this and did some tin catalyzed chemistry to look at the comparison of this. And you can look at the just the proton NMR, you can look at the carbon-13 NMR as well, and look at the linkages along the polymer chain, and that can tell you something about the block lengths. And the first thing that we can notice here is that for the zirconium catalyzed reaction, as we increase the glycolide in the feed, we actually increase the glycolide block length significantly more than we do in the tin case. So what that's telling us is that the zirconium catalyzed copolymer is more blocky than the tin catalyzed polymer. We can confirm that by, or at least we can establish the reasons for that by doing some kinetics, and Neve's done a lot of these kinetics that lead to the reactivity ratios of the glycolide and lactide for comparing the zirconium and the sort of classical tin catalyst. And to cut a long story short, and there's an awful lot of data contained in this slide, and so it doesn't really do it justice. But in fact, if you compare the zirconium to the tin, the reactivity of glycolide ring opening in the zirconium case is greater than that of the tin, but the reactivity to lactide is significantly less than that for the tin. So the reactivity ratio for zirconium, so the proclivity to ring open glycolide rather than lactide, is significantly greater than the reactivity ratio for glycolide over lactide for tin. And that's what gives us this significantly more blocky structure. And that's, remember, we can do this in the melt, and it's a one-pot reaction where we throw all the monomers in at the same time. So this is at least potentially amenable to an industrial process, or at least scaling up. And this has consequences for the material properties. The lactide chain length, as we go from 5% glycolide content to 10 to 15 to 20, and I think that should be 25, not 5 again. We see increasing crystallization of the lactide chain here. So with the zirconium catalyst, under the same conditions as we would have for the tin catalyst, the zirconium catalyst is semi-crystalline and the tin catalyst is amorphous. So that gives us some hint that the additional control that we have in the zirconium catalyst is really helping us here. So that's an ongoing project, and Neve's working away at that. These are the things that really she's established so far. What we're doing now is we're producing films, and she has some really nice films now. And with those films, we're going to start doing more mechanical testing and look at some of the barrier properties of these materials, and see if we can really tune and enhance the properties of PLA by introducing, in a controlled way, small amounts of glycolic acid into the, or at least glycolide, into the polymer chain. And of course, the other thing where the properties of these two materials, and the glycolide is desirable and the lactide is not, is in degradation. So if we can use this to control the degradation of PLA, rather than just have the hydrolysis of polyglycolic acid, which is too great, and the hydrolysis of polylactic acid, which isn't great enough. If we can control this with the catalytic approach that we've got, then that will give us some interesting end-of-life options for the copolymers that we can potentially make. So that's really where we are looking at an extension of work that we've done over a number of years, establishing the zirconium alkoxide catalyst. what I want to do now is look a little bit at some work that another PhD student of mine, Philip Yang's been doing over the last few years, which is extending some other work we've done on switch ionic zirconium catalysts, which are related. So I'm just going to take a step back and understand why we might be interested in looking at cyclic polymers. I mean, in terms of polymer topology, it's fairly straightforward that you can have linear polymers, branch polymers, star-shaped polymers, and you can also have cyclic polymers, which of course are the only ones without any ends. It's actually been pretty difficult to make cyclic polymers over the years. I'll maybe touch on that a little bit later on. But if you can make a pure cyclic polymer, one that's not significantly contaminated with linear components, the properties are really interesting. They have lower viscosities, and that might make processing of a particular polymer useful. They have higher glass transition temperatures and greater thermal stability because they don't have chain ends, which can lead to thermal instability. And they potentially have faster crystallization rates, but they are significantly less reported in the literature. And the main reason for that is that they ain't very easy to make. At least they're not very easy to make pure and uncontaminated. So there are various mechanisms that one can consider for cyclic polymers. Ring closures typically require high dilution. There are some sort of subsets of ring closures, but you know it's fairly obvious what a ring closure mechanism is. But the alternative and the polymerization method that is amenable to scaling, if you like, for cyclic polymers, so is perhaps most interesting, is looking at ring expansion polymerization. And this is typically a catalytic process where you insert the catalyst into a monomer or a particular size ring. And propagation of that to give you whatever catalytic material here takes place it can be a living type process until you then get cyclization and get the catalyst back again. So, you know, it's not unrelated to living ring opening polymerization, but subtly different. And I don't really want to go into the details of the kinetics here. But the point is that ring expansion polymerization is a really interesting technique for making pure cyclic polymers. There's been a renewed interest in this area in the last few years. I've just picked out a couple of a few key examples. There's a seminal example from Weymouth and Hedrick and colleagues who published this N-heterocyclic carbene synthesis of cyclic PLA in 2007. They did a lot of kinetics on this, and a lot of the early understanding of ring expansion polymerization came from their seminal work. Polly Arnold and Charlotte Williams recently published some work on a really interesting cerium catalyst here that is incredibly active and gives really pure rings at very low catalyst loadings. And that's a really interesting piece of work as well. But really where we got interested in these cyclic polymers, and you'll see why in a minute, is reports that Krickledorf in Germany has been generating for, I would say, probably 5 to 10 years now, looking at tin catalysts, so tin octanoate, and these cataclate species in particular are really interesting ones. Where you generate this tin cataclate species in situ, up here somewhere, and you do the ring expansion polymerization, and you end up with pretty pure rings of PLA. And we thought this is really quite similar to some work that we've been doing with the zirconium catalysts over the years. And again, I don't want to spend any time doing this, but this is work that we've been doing with industrial partners over the last 10 years or so. That was recently patented as an industrial catalytic process that's really unique in being competitive with tin under genuine industrial conditions. And to cut a long story short, what we have is we have these viter-ionic zirconium phenoxides, which don't, in contrast to the previous zirconium system I showed, don't have a labile alkoxide group. They're pretty stable and robust species. They're actually air stable. But it turns out that they're very good catalysts in a similar way to tin carboxylates are. They're very good catalysts for the ring opening polymerization under industrial conditions of lactide. We get extremely high activity of these catalysts. We can go down to extremely low loadings under the right sort of formulations. And it turns out that this is, again, with one of my colleagues at Bath, Antoine Bouchard, we've done quite a lot of calculations on these. And we're fairly happy that this is a ligand-assisted activated monomer mechanism in this case, where the trisphenolate can sort of breathe and open up a bit to allow both the initiator and the lactide to come in, and then that can propagate the ring opening polymerization in that way. So that isn't a million miles away from what you might expect with a ring expansion polymerization catalyst. So we were encouraged to look at these zirconium catalysts for ring expansion polymerization of lactide. And again, I won't go through too many synthetic details here, but similar to the tin examples that were published by Krickeldorf, we utilize similar conditions, 160 degrees, typically solvent-free, 1 or 2 hours reaction time. So reasonably reactive systems. And with this zirconium trisphenolate catalyst, we can take L-lactide or D-lactide or the racemic mixture of the two. We can make isotactic rings, we can make heterotactic rings, because remember, well, actually the zirconium catalyst is heterotactic. If we use the tin version, we get an atactic polymer microstructure. And if we take the D-lactide, we get isotactic PDLA. So we get high conversions with these things. We get no observable linear contaminants. I'll show you on the next slide some evidence for that. We get no racemization, no transesterification. This is really rather similar to the results we were getting with the ring opening polymerization of these zirconium catalysts under industrial conditions. So they're very well controlled catalysts, and the really interesting thing is that they do give us heterotactic, they give us stereo selectivity for these ring systems. I don't think any heterotactic selectivity have been reported for tin before, but we've looked at this in parallel with the zirconium work we've been doing, and we do see some evidence for heterotactic selectivity for tin, but there's far more selectivity in the zirconium catalysts. So with this well-controlled polymerization to give us cyclic compounds in hand, we thought we'd better do a little bit of further investigation of these things. So just some of the data, let me just move that down a bit, that characterizes the cyclic PLA that we're making here. This is Malditov mass spec. You can see from this, all of these species here are cyclic species. There's no linear contaminants that we can see by mass spec. Nice controlled polymerization. By GPC, we can look at the Mark-Haring plot, which gives us a comparison of a similar molecular weight linear PLA and the cyclic PLA. The viscosity of the polymer, as you might expect with simple arguments, but the viscosity of the polymer, and this is typical of cyclic polymer systems, and typical of pure cyclic polymer systems, is lower. And in this case, it's about 70% lower than the comparative linear PLA. As I said, we can make the poly L lactic acid and we can make the poly D lactic acid as separate cycles, and we can stereo complex those together. And this shows a DSC trace showing the crystallization of the stereo complex here at 220 degrees. So that's quite an unusual sort of cyclic system that we're looking at there. In general, not with this picture here, but in general, the glass transition temperature is enhanced over linear, and we're seeing this with the zirconium catalyst by around 5 degrees. But by doing stereo complexation, we can really enhance the melting points of these materials, these cyclic materials. So we thought we'd really push the control that we were getting with these with this ring expansion polymerization. And one of the things that, again, we've done with linear polymers in the past using a co-initiator, we've done similar experiments. But I'll just take you through this experiment. What Philip's done here is he's taken the L-lactide, and catalyze the ring expansion polymerization to the cyclic PLLA to around about 80% conversion. And then in the same pot, he's added the D-lactide. And what that does is it potentially gives us the stereoblock isotactic cyclic PLA, where you've got that first isotactic block and then the second isotactic block there. Just some data to show that we're not making separate polymers here. Let's go to the GPC data first. This is the point at which we've got 80% conversion and we start throwing the D-lactide in there. And you can see that the polymer molecular weight keeps increasing as the D-lactide is converted and the last sample was 85% conversion there. So that's highly indicative of having one ring with two stereo blocks involved in it. If we look at the homonuclear decoupled NMR spectrum, pure isotactic would just have these III tetrads here, but we do see some evidence for heterotactic or atactic polymer in here from these other tetrad signals that we see in the homonuclear decoupled NMR. And that is actually, when you think about it, exactly what we would expect. So we've gone to 80% conversion, so we still have some of the L monomer present in the reaction mixture here when we add the D. And then we know that we have heterotactic selectivity using this zirconium catalyst. So what we would expect is that the remaining L-lactide will preferentially polymerize with the D to use up the remaining L in an atactic or a slightly heterotactic block, a small block of atactic or slightly heterotactic PLA there. And then from that point, there's only D left, so you get an isotactic block. So essentially, we've got a stereo block, diblock isotactic PLA here, with probably with a small atactic bit that mops up the remaining L-lactide monomer, and that's what we're seeing with these. That's what we think we're seeing with these signals here from the homonuclear decoupled NMR. What we haven't done yet is we haven't gone on to look at the thermal properties of this and whether this stereo complex is to itself, which will be really interesting, and we're really excited about what we can do. Now we can start to make some interesting polymer architectures of these things. I'll just one more point on the cyclic polymers. Philip, in collaboration with his co-supervisor, in fact, Karen Edler, has done some small angle neutron scattering, some SANs on these samples. Because we have access to some very well controlled cyclic PLA samples, which never been looked at in this context before, it's quite interesting to look at them. So he recently did some experiments on D11 and ILL in Grenoble, and here's some data from those experiments. The most similar thing that had been looked at previously was cyclic polystyrene. And in a general sense, we get similar scattering to the previous study on cyclic polystyrene. But there are some really interesting points that come out of this work that Karen and Philip have done. First of all, if we look at this parameter here, the lower this is, it corresponds to a more favorable solvent environment. And you can see there's a significant difference here between the cyclic PLA in blue and the linear PLA in red. The difference for molecular weights, there really isn't much difference, but there's certainly a difference between the cyclic and linear. And we can ignore the difference here, although there are some subtle differences in temperature. But if we just focus on this bit here, what we're saying is that the solvent environment in cyclic PLA is significantly more favorable than the solvent environment, this is in acetone, by the way, than the solvent environment for linear PLA. A similar thing was seen for the polystyrene, but it wasn't nearly so differentiated between the cyclic and linear. And the other interesting thing that we're seeing here is because we've got samples with controlled microstructure here, which hasn't been looked at before. We've got the heterotactic example that we've made, or made with the zirconium catalyst. We've got atactic examples made with the tin catalyst, and we've got isotactic examples that can be made with either, in fact, but just using the pure monomer rather than the racemic monomer. And if we look at the just focus on the cyclic PLA, we see there's the polymer microstructure has a significant effect on solvation for the cyclic, but in fact not the linear PLA. So really this quite detailed work is reinforcing the point that cyclic polymers can show some really interesting properties. And this is pretty fundamental work at this stage. We're not really at the stage where we're converting this into useful properties. But what it means is using the cyclic polymers and using the polymer architectures we can impart with stereoselective and well-controlled catalysts, we can really start to tune the physical properties of the cyclic PLA that we're making, which is really interesting to me. I'm just going to finish for 5 or 10 minutes, just change tack a little bit and talk about some of the work that Cameron had done in his PhD over the last, finishing about a year ago now. And this is a little bit different, but it's using a different monomer, but this is looking at high performance fire-based polyamides using a titanium alkoxide catalyst. So if you like, it's the same principles. What we're doing is we're looking at a bio-based feedstock and we're applying well-controlled and benign catalytic technologies to it that are scalable to industrial processes. So potentially have a real application. And again, I'm just going to take a step back for a minute and just look at, sorry, I've lost my slides here. There we are. And just by way of background, again, you're probably more familiar with this than lactic acid, if anything. But HMF is a really interesting renewable platform chemical, and it's one of the most promising ones to derive bulk commodity materials from renewable resources. We can get it from biomass, we can get it from non-edible sources, and chemical and biological conversion along the way gets us to HMF. So I think we're all familiar with HMF. And of course, the next step in making some interesting polymers, there's interesting things, of course, you can do with HMF anyway. But if you oxidize that to the dicarboxylic acid, furan dicarboxylic acid, FDCA, that oxidation can be done chemically or biocatalytically. And in fact, that was where we first got into this area, was working with Corbion, who sponsored Cameron's PhD project, because they had an interesting biocatalytic route to making very pure FDCA. Once you got to FDCA, and again, this is probably familiar to many of the people in this seminar, is you can use that as potentially a drop-in replacement for terphthalic acid, which is one of the major monomers used in one of the most important polymers, PET, most important commercial polymers for packaging and fiber applications. So the theory goes that we can take this bio-based aromatic monomer and replace the petroleum-based terphthalic acid here, and we can make PEF as opposed to PET. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. There's an awful lot of work being done on this towards commercialization. There's a pilot plant that Avantium have started in the Netherlands, and it's a slow process, but it's getting there. And PEF has some really interesting properties. I don't want to talk about PEF. I want to talk about FDCA in the context of semi-aromatic polyamides. So polyamides are interesting materials. There's aliphatic ones, semi-aromatic ones, and fully aromatic ones. So we go everything from nylon all the way through to Kevlar. And these semi-aromatic ones are high-performance polymers, typical applications in automotive and electronics, electrical, sort of structural engineering polymers, if you like. So they're really important commercial polymers. Typically, terphthalic acid is used, and the numbering system is polyamide 4 with the terphthalic acid, polyamide 6. So the aliphatic chain is 4 or 6, and that numbering system follows all the way through. in looking at making these things using FDCA as a building block and whatever amine you want to use as the monomer, there's been quite a lot of previous work, but nothing has really looked scalable to date. So there's a number of approaches here. The nylon salt approach, you only get low molecular weights typically with this approach, and this is because of decarboxylation that can take place. It is one of the major disadvantages of this approach. So high molecular weight polyamides have never really been made this way. You can do direct polymerization, but then you're using solvents. You can make high molecular weight polymers, but it's really not scalable because of the use of solvents there. And then things like interfacial polymerization, again, you can make high molecular weight polymers this way, but again, you're using solvents, and it's really not amenable to an industrial polycondensation of a commodity polymer. So we thought we'd have a look at these based on work that we've done for making PEF using titanium catalysts. So what Cameron did was he took the this diamine and the methyl ester of FDCA and undertook a sort of two-step melt polymerization process, which is something that we and others have developed to make PEF in the past using similar catalysts. We're using titanium-based catalysts. We can use very low catalyst loadings. Of course, this is a process, it's a melt polymerization, it's a melt polycondensation, so it's potentially an industrially favored process. And hopefully we can make high molecular weight polymers. Again, just to cut what was actually a very long story short, we were able to screen catalysts using this really useful thin film reactor we have on a small scale. And in screening those catalysts, we were able to make polyamides, semi-aromatic polyamides, PA6F here, where where you've got 6 aliphatic carbons and the furanic aromatic portion of the polyamide, up to really good molecular weights here, with good catalytic activity for the well, but both molecular weights are pretty good. We scaled this up, and in fact, we scaled it up further, probably to significant number of kilograms for similar ones now, Cameron, I think. But we can scale this up to a reasonable level, and then we're looking at the titanium citrate catalyst here as one of the best ones, where we use torque here as a proxy for intrinsic viscosity and therefore molecular weight. So we can make high molecular weight polyamides using very small loading of titanium catalysts for the first time. And again, I don't want to really dwell on this, but the properties of the polymers that Cameron's been making are really, really interesting. They're competitive with the terphthalic acid equivalents, and I guess the tensile tests here really bear that out. So if you look at the data here, it really is comparable to the commercial polymers that are available using terphthalic acid rather than FDCA as a monomer. They can be thermally processed and transformed into films. They have really high thermal stability and really good glass transition temperatures. So that's work, again, that's ongoing. Cameron's Catalysis Hub project, hopefully he's going to tell you something about that at the Catalysis Hub conference in December, so I didn't really want to steal his thunder. But that's using FDCA and other derivatives of HMF in a related way, but making some really interesting new polymers. But this work is being continued and scaled up as we go on. We're really looking for applications for this. So as I mentioned, scaling it up to a few kilograms, so we can work with our colleagues at the National Composite Centre to make things like automotive parts as demonstrators. So I think that's, I'm probably just about out of time. That's really all I had to say. It didn't seem worth having a sort of fairly facile number of bullet points of conclusions, and I think they've been going as we've been through. But it is important to thank the people who did the work and collaborated and funded the work, I've mentioned Neve and Philip and Cameron as we've gone through. You might spot them in there looking quite jolly. Much of this work has been done with some fantastic colleagues and collaborators, Matthew Jones and Karen Edler and Antoine Bouchard at Bath, and some of our industrial collaborators who have worked with us over many years in some cases, Harriet and Sicko at Corbion and Total Corbion, and Steve, who co-sponsored Philip's PhD through Scott Barder. All of these other people have been involved in the funding as well. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for listening, if any of you are left. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, for your lovely talk. Yeah, I think right on time. So I guess I was looking for some questions. But yeah, Matt, can you give us some comments about this cyclic polymers, which were really interesting, of course, working with Philip Young in the lab. So do you think that this cyclic polymers, for instance, cyclic PLA, which you talked about earlier, how is the degradation? Do you think that it will be more readily combustible, or it will have any different degradation behavior?
It's actually a really interesting question, because you might expect, in the same way as they're typically more thermally stable because there isn't an end to attack, that they might be less susceptible to degradation. I'm not aware of any detailed degradation studies that have been done on them. It's a really good point, actually. I mean, we should look at some sort of proxy for that, you know, see if we can see any difference in linear and cyclic, you know, just base degradation, just as a proxy for biodegradation. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, and yeah, another question might be, which is you already answered, about the thermal properties of the cyclic polymers. So because currently PLA has this limitation of the thermal properties, because it cannot be hot fill in the applications where you need to hot fill the liquids or something into your packaging. So I think I saw something like that with cyclic polymer, you can enhance the glass transition temperature, but I don't know how high you can go in terms of, let's say, usually the glass transitions for PLA are 60-65 degrees. Do you think that it can be controlled in a way to enhance it further, and to further enhance the application of PLA as a polymer in hot fill application areas of packaging?
Yeah, my gut feeling is I wouldn't get too excited about getting a 30 increase in, say, heat deflection temperatures or something, by that simple topological change. I mean, I think it tends to be a few degrees enhancement, which, you know, wouldn't allow you to walk about with hot coffee. I think, you know, I think copolymers of PLA, and particularly sort of stereo complexation of PLA, is really the way to enhance the thermal properties. That said, I mean, I think, as you well know, I think those seemingly quite small changes in things like viscosity and glass transition temperature can have a big impact on processability. So, you know, there might be some advantages that you can confer on a polymer system in terms of processability, but I don't think that ultimate thermal performance will change in a life-changing way.
So there's a question in the question answer, Matt. So what is the oxidative stability like of the PTF polymer with the furfural present? So I guess it's about the furan-based polymers oxidative stability.
Well, I mean, you could probably answer that as well as I can, but in terms of the thermal stability by TGA, it's really high. So there's no obvious disadvantage in terms of oxidative stability compared to having a terphthalic linker in there, as far as we've seen. I'm not aware of anything in the literature that says one thing or the other. Are you? You're the expert on this, aren't you?
No, I think we haven't dedicatedly studied the oxidative stability, but usually when we have the rings in the structure, it provides us stability in terms of, as you said, that from the TGA analysis, we saw that their thermal stability is at par compared to the, let's say, terephthalic acid-based polymers. So there is no downside to it at the moment, which we would see, but of course it needs further investigation, I guess, in the future. In terms of our polyamide-based structures. There is another question from Lou is, can you envisage ways to fuse rings of cyclic polymers to make larger rings or make interlocking rings?
Yeah, thanks, Lucian. That's again, that's a really interesting question. We don't know whether there is any catenation or not of the rings. It's I think that requires. We were hoping we might see some evidence from the sands for that sort of thing. I think it requires really detailed rheology. You might imagine that, you know, the molecular weights of the rings we've got, that you may well get some catenation, and you should be able to reveal that by rheological measurements, I think. But we don't know is the simple answer, but I'd be really surprised if there wasn't any catenation.
Cool.
We're also interested in the interaction between the, you know, threading the linear polymer with the cyclic one as well. The polymers these are quite difficult to characterize, as you
yeah. And there is a question from Santosh. Would there be any differences between the FDCA and TEP derived bottles?
Yeah, sorry, Santosh, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Can you?
I think it might be FDCA based and terephthalic acid based bottles. Yeah.
Yes, there are differences. So you mean the differences between PET and PEF? Yes, I mean there are differences, and one of and I would refer you to Evantium's publicity material on this. So I mean, one of the differences is that the PEF has a higher oxygen barrier than PET, so potentially you can make far lighter weight bottles with the same performance in terms of barrier properties. On the downside, I think most PEF bottles would look quite yellow compared to their PET counterparts. But you know, so and the processing, again, sort of coming back to the question I was talking about before, the answer I gave before, sort of differences in processability can be quite subtle, and PEF is not the same as PET in terms of the processability to make bottles. So there's technical challenges in developing that further, I think, but that's not something that we look at directly. But on a gross level, they're very similar polymers, but the more you sort of get into the technological side of it, the more subtle differences I think there are.
Yeah, I think the time is now up for the webinar, but Matt, thank you for the inspirational talk. I think we have learned quite new things about the polymers, so thank you so much. Yeah,
thank you very much. Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you, everybody. Bye.